5 minutes earlier, Jacob Thornton had been alone in his world, certain the winter could not surprise him anymore. 5 minutes later, he stood frozen in his barn doorway, staring at a woman and an infant curled in the straw like the storm had delivered them as a test. The Montana night pressed against the ranch with steady force, driving snow in sheets so thick the lantern light barely held its shape. Jacob had crossed the yard only to check on his mare and the barn latch he meant to mend, thinking about nothing but chores and the long stretch of quiet that always waited for him inside his cabin. The barn smelled of hay and warm animals, a familiar comfort. He shut the door behind him and listened for the usual sounds: shifting hooves, a soft snort, the creak of timber. Then he heard something else, faint and uneven, like a cough trying not to be heard. Jacob lifted the lantern higher and walked toward the back stall. Shadows moved where they didn't belong. Behind a stack of boards, a woman huddled with a bundle pressed tight against her chest. Her hair was damp and tangled, lashes speckled with ice. She looked up as if the light hurt, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. The bundle stirred, and a thin, tiny sound slipped out, more breath than cry. Jacob's throat tightened without warning. A memory flashed through him. A cradle in a quiet room, untouched, the kind of quiet that never truly leaves a man. He swallowed hard and kept his face steady. "Ma'am," he said, low and careful, "you can't stay in here." The woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak. "Please," she whispered. Just a moment. My baby is so cold." Jacob stepped closer and saw the infant's cheeks flushed from the cold, the mouth slightly open, breath shallow but there. He didn't ask why she'd come to his barn or where her family was. The answers could wait. Winter didn't. He shrugged off his wool coat and wrapped it around both of them. The woman flinched at the movement, then clutched the bundle tighter as if she expected it to be taken. Jacob slowed his hands and spoke again, quieter now. "I'm not here to hurt you. My cabin is close." She stared at him, trying to decide whether to trust the only help she had found. "My name is Sarah," she managed. "Sarah Mitchell. We were traveling. I got sick. They left us when the snow came." The words came out flat, like she had repeated them too many times to make them feel real. Jacob nodded once, not because he understood, but because he believed her. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath the baby, lifting them together. Sarah was shockingly light, as if the road had taken more from her than it had given. The infant's tiny hand moved, brushing his shirt, and that small touch pulled at something in Jacob he'd kept buried for years. Outside, the wind struck like a solid thing. Jacob hunched his body to shield them as he crossed the yard. Snow stung his face and filled his tracks behind him almost as soon as he made them. Sarah's head sagged against his shoulder, and he tightened his grip, murmuring, "Stay awake, we're almost there." Inside the cabin, he kicked the door shut and carried them straight to the stove. He stoked the fire until it roared, then set a kettle on to warm. Sarah's hands shook as she adjusted the baby in her arms. "Her name is Emma," she whispered, voice breaking on the last word. Jacob poured water into a cup, his fingers clumsy, and set it near Sarah. His cabin, which had felt like a hard shell for so long, suddenly seemed too small to hold the sound of another person breathing. The baby let out a soft whimper, then went quiet again, and Jacob realized he had already made a choice. He could send them back into the storm and protect his loneliness, or he could bring them into the light and risk everything he'd been avoiding. He looked at Sarah, at the fear she tried to hide, at the baby's fragile stillness, and the old isolation in him shifted, cracking like ice under weight. By the third morning, the storm had settled into a steady, stubborn cold, the kind that made the world feel smaller. Snow lay heavy on the roof and along the windowsills, and the ranch looked like it had been erased and redrawn in white. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer, But Jacob Thornton still moved like a man expecting the quiet to snap back into place at any moment. He kept the fire fed and the kettle full, telling himself the woman and her baby were only passing through. Just until the roads opened. Just until they could reach town. Sarah Mitchell sat near the stove with Emma tucked close, both wrapped in blankets Jacob had pulled from a chest that hadn't been opened in years. The first day, Sarah barely spoke. She watched Jacob's hands more than his face, tracking every movement as if measuring whether she was safe. When he set food on the table, she hesitated before taking it, like she was waiting for the kindness to have a price. Jacob didn't push. He simply placed the plate down and stepped back. Emma recovered faster than Sarah. The baby's color returned, and her cries grew stronger, the sound filling corners of the cabin that had only held silence. Jacob found himself listening for her breathing whenever the room grew still. He hated how quickly that habit formed, and he hated how much it mattered. Once, when Sarah stepped outside to shake out a blanket, Emma fussed in her arms. Jacob reached out without thinking and rested a finger in the baby's palm. Her tiny hand closed around it, firm for something so small. Jacob froze, then slowly pulled his hand back, as if he'd touched something sacred. Sarah noticed. Her eyes softened for a moment before she looked away. "She likes warmth," Sarah said quietly, as if explaining the world. "She always has." Jacob nodded, clearing his throat. "This cabin holds heat well. If the wind stays down, it'll be bearable." They settled into a careful routine. Jacob rose before sunrise to split wood, break ice at the trough, and check the animals. He worked hard, not only because the ranch demanded it, but because motion kept his thoughts from turning in circles. Sarah cleaned what she could, even when Jacob insisted she should rest. She swept the floor with slow movements, wiped the table, and mended a torn shirt Jacob hadn't asked her to fix. When he noticed the stitches, he frowned as if the cloth had changed without permission. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," Sarah replied, still working the needle. "But I wanted to." The words hung between them. Jacob didn't know what to do with someone who wanted things in his space without trying to take it over. He accepted the shirt back with a short nod and returned to his coffee. At night, Sarah fed Emma by the fire while Jacob sat at the table sharpening tools or fixing leather straps. They didn't talk much, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like two people sharing the same room without needing to fill every moment. Still, Jacob's eyes often drifted to the far corner where a small door stood closed. It was a simple door, plain wood, but it might as well have been made of stone. Sarah noticed him looking. "What's in there?" she asked one evening, her voice gentle. Jacob's jaw tightened. "Storage," he said too quickly. Sarah lowered her gaze, not arguing. "All right." She didn't press, and that made Jacob uneasy in a different way. He had expected questions, pity, some attempt to fix him. Instead, she simply lived beside him, caring for her child and doing small tasks that made the cabin feel less like a place someone waited to die in. Emma began to smile, first at her mother, then at the light from the fire, and then, one afternoon, at Jacob when he walked in carrying an armful of wood. The baby's face brightened as if he belonged there. Jacob paused in the doorway, his arms full, snow melting off his coat. For a second he couldn't breathe. He set the wood down and turned away, pretending to brush snow from his sleeve. But the truth stayed with him. The house was changing. It was waking up. And Jacob, despite everything he told himself, didn't know if he wanted it to stop. The sun finally showed itself, pale and weak, but the cold did not let go. Days passed in a slow rhythm, and the cabin settled into something that felt almost normal. Jacob Thornton kept telling himself it was temporary. As soon as the road opened, Sarah Mitchell would take her baby and go to town. That thought should have brought relief, yet it started to feel like a weight he carried from room to room. Emma grew stronger with each day. She kicked her feet when Sarah held her near the stove, and she stared at Jacob like she was trying to understand him. One afternoon, while Sarah washed clothes in a basin, Emma began to fuss, her face red and scrunched tight. Sarah tried rocking her, then humming under her breath, but the baby only grew louder. Jacob stood at the table repairing a harness strap. The sound scraped at him, not because it bothered him, but because it pulled him into the moment in a way he couldn't avoid. Sarah looked up, tired and embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said. "She's been fussy all morning." Jacob hesitated. He should have stayed where he was. He should have kept his distance and let Sarah handle it. Instead, he set the strap down and walked over, holding out his hands without thinking. "May I?" he asked, voice careful. Sarah blinked, surprised, then slowly placed Emma in his arms. Emma's crying stopped so fast it startled them both. The baby stared up at Jacob's face, wide-eyed, then let out a soft sound that was almost a laugh. Jacob stood still, afraid that one wrong move would break the calm. He shifted his grip, supporting Emma's back the way Sarah did. The baby's small hand caught his shirt and held on. Sarah watched him closely. Her shoulders loosened, just a little. "She likes you," she said, like it was a fact she couldn't deny. Jacob swallowed. "She likes warmth," he answered, trying to keep it simple. But it wasn't only warmth. Over the next week, Emma began to expect him. When Jacob came in from chores, she turned toward the door. When he sat near the stove, she leaned toward him. Sarah noticed the way Jacob's face changed when he looked at the baby, how his eyes softened before he could stop it. She began speaking more too, small stories from the road, quiet comments about the weather, simple questions about ranch work. Jacob answered in short replies at first, then longer ones when he forgot to guard his words. One evening, Sarah stood at the window, watching the snow fall in thin, steady lines. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't checked the barn," she said. Jacob stared at the fire. "You found shelter, that's all." Sarah turned to face him. "No," she said gently. "You found us." The words landed hard. Jacob wanted to brush them aside, to keep everything flat and safe. Instead, he felt something rise in him, hope, maybe, or need, and it scared him more than the storm ever had. In the middle of that growing closeness, the cabin handed him a reminder he wasn't ready to hold. It happened on a day when Sarah was rocking Emma to sleep, and Jacob decided to clear out a drawer that stuck. The drawer had been jammed so long he'd stopped trying. He yanked it hard, and it finally gave, spilling old things onto the floor. A small knitted cap, a faded ribbon, and a tiny wooden rattle with a crack along the handle. Jacob froze. His chest tightened as if the room had lost its air. He picked up the rattle with slow hands, staring at it like it belonged to someone else. The memory came sharp and clear. His wife's tired smile, the quiet nursery that never stayed warm enough. The way he had promised he would protect what mattered. Then the promise had failed, and the loss had settled into him like a permanent winter. Behind him, Emma made a soft sound in her sleep. Jacob flinched, and the rattle slipped from his hand, tapping the floor. Sarah looked over, startled by the noise. Her eyes went from Jacob's face to the small cap and the broken rattle. "I didn't mean to pry," she said quickly, as if she'd stepped into a place she wasn't allowed. Jacob's voice came out rough. "It's nothing." Sarah didn't believe him, but she didn't argue. She only lowered her gaze and held Emma closer. That quiet respect should have eased him. Instead, it made him feel worse, because it showed him how easily she could fit into his life if he let her. That night, Jacob sat alone at the table after Sarah carried Emma to the bed. He stared at the closed door in the corner, and then at the snow pressing against the window. He thought about what it would mean to keep them here, to let Emma learn his footsteps and let Sarah settle into the cabin like she belonged. He also thought about what it would mean to lose them after that, to watch the world take something else from him. The fear was old, but it was still strong. By morning, he made his decision, and it hurt in a quiet way. He began talking about town more often. He checked the road conditions even when the weather hadn't changed. He counted supplies and set aside a small bundle of food for the journey, keeping his tone calm and practical. Sarah noticed the change. "You're eager to see us gone," she said one afternoon, not accusing, just stating it. Jacob forced a small, polite smile. "It's safer in town," he said. "You'll have people. A doctor if Emma needs one. A church. Work. And here?" Sarah asked softly. "What is here?" Jacob looked at Emma, who was watching him with bright, trusting eyes. His chest tightened again, and he turned away before anyone could see what it did to him. "Here is winter," he said, choosing the cold answer because it was easier than the honest one. "And winter ends. You should be ready when it does." The first clear morning felt like permission. The wind had eased, and the sky was a hard blue that made the snow look almost clean. Jacob hitched his horse and loaded a small wagon with food, blankets, and the few items Sarah had gathered. He kept his face calm and his voice steady, acting like this was only a practical decision. Sarah moved quietly, wrapping Emma tight and checking her every few minutes, as if she could protect the baby with attention alone. They left just after sunrise. The ranch disappeared behind them, swallowed by the white hills and scattered pine trees. Jacob held the reins with stiff hands, watching the road ahead. Sarah sat beside him, Emma in her arms, her eyes scanning the empty land. Neither of them spoke much. The wagon wheels creaked, and the cold air pressed into every gap in their clothes. After a few miles, Emma began to fuss. At first it sounded like normal discomfort, the small complaints of a baby who wanted warmth. Sarah shifted her, pulled the blanket higher, and murmured soft words. Jacob tried to focus on the trail, but he kept glancing at Emma's face. The baby's cheeks were flushed again, and her breathing seemed faster. Sarah touched Emma's forehead and went still. "She's too warm," Sarah whispered. Jacob's stomach tightened. "Maybe it's the blanket," he said, though he knew that didn't make sense in this cold. Sarah loosened the wrap, but Emma's fussing didn't ease. It grew weaker, like the baby was running out of strength. Sarah's voice shook. "Jacob, something's wrong." Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop. The quiet around them felt heavy, broken only by the horse's breath and the soft sounds Sarah made as she tried to soothe Emma. Emma's eyes fluttered, unfocused, and the baby's small body felt limp in Sarah's arms. "We're turning back," Jacob said, sharper than he meant to. Sarah looked at him, fear plain on her face. "Town is closer now," she said, desperation rising. "If we keep going, maybe we can find a doctor." Jacob stared down the road, then back at the empty land behind them. The road to town was still long, and the weather could shift without warning. He thought of how Emma had looked the night he found her, and he couldn't bear to gamble. "No," he said firmly. "My cabin is closer. It's warm. I have supplies. We'll get her stable, then decide." Sarah hesitated, torn between hope and panic. Then Emma made a small, strained sound, and Sarah's decision was made. She nodded, eyes wet. Jacob snapped the reins and turned the wagon around, urging the horse into a faster pace than was safe. Snow sprayed from the wheels. Jacob's jaw was clenched so tight it ached. By the time they reached the ranch, Sarah was shaking. Jacob lifted her down without a word and guided her inside, moving with quick purpose. He shoved more wood into the stove, fed the fire until the cabin warmed, and boiled water. Sarah sat in the chair by the heat. Emma pressed to her chest, whispering prayers under her breath. Jacob searched through his supplies with hands that didn't feel steady, finding clean cloths, a bottle, anything that might help. "I should have listened," Sarah said suddenly, voice breaking. "I should have stayed. I pushed her too hard." Jacob looked at Emma's face, at the way the baby's breathing changed in short, uneven waves. His chest tightened with guilt that had been building for days. "No," he said, but the word didn't fix anything. Sarah's eyes lifted to him, raw and honest. "You wanted us gone," she said softly. "And I wanted to believe leaving would hurt less than staying and losing everything." Jacob flinched, as if she'd struck him, because she was right. He set a hand on the back of the chair, steadying himself. "I was afraid," he admitted, the truth coming out before he could stop it. "I thought if I didn't let you belong here, it couldn't break me." Sarah stared at him, tears slipping down her cheeks without sound. "We're already broken," she whispered, "but Emma needs us to be brave." Jacob swallowed hard, watching the tiny rise and fall of Emma's chest. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the cold. It was a place where choices mattered. And for the first time, Jacob understood that silence had never protected him. It had only kept him alone. Spring did not arrive with fanfare on Jacob Thornton's ranch. It came in small signs that could be missed if a person wasn't looking. Snow thinning along the fence lines, water dripping from the eaves, the first soft patches of brown earth showing through. Inside the cabin, the change was easier to see. Emma's cheeks were full again, her eyes bright, her hands always reaching for something. Sarah moved with less tension in her shoulders, as if she had finally stopped waiting for the next bad turn. The night Emma recovered, Jacob didn't sleep. He sat by the stove until the coals dimmed, listening to the steady sounds of Sarah and the baby breathing. Fear still lived in him, but it no longer felt like a warning he had to obey. It felt like a question. And when morning came, he realized he was tired of answering it the same way. He waited until Sarah was feeding Emma near the window. The sunlight was weak but real, stretching across the floorboards. Jacob stood near the table, hands rough and unsure, like a man learning how to speak again. "I've been thinking," he said. Sarah's eyes lifted, cautious. "About town?" Jacob shook his head once. "About here," he said. "About what I tried to do. I told myself I was helping you by sending you away. The truth is, I was protecting myself." Sarah didn't interrupt. She just held Emma closer, her face calm but watchful. Jacob swallowed. "I lost my wife years ago," he said, forcing the words out without letting them turn into an excuse. "And our baby. After that, I shut every door I could. I thought if I kept my life small, nothing else could be taken from me." Sarah's expression softened, but her eyes filled anyway. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jacob nodded, accepting it but not leaning on it. "When you and Emma came here, the cabin felt alive again, and that scared me. I started acting cold because I didn't want to need anything. I didn't want to need you." Emma made a small sound, then reached a hand toward Jacob. It was a simple motion, but it hit him hard. Jacob stepped closer, slowly, and Emma's fingers closed around one of his. Sarah watched, her breath caught. "Jacob," she said quietly, "what are you saying?" He looked at Sarah, and his voice lowered. "I'm saying I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because it's easier. Not because winter is gone. Because you belong here if you want to. Both of you." Sarah's eyes shimmered. "I've been afraid to hope," she admitted. "I've been afraid you'd change your mind the moment I started to feel safe." Jacob let out a slow breath. "I can't promise life won't hurt," he said. "But I can promise I won't run from it anymore." He crossed the room to the small door in the corner, the one he had avoided for years. His hand hovered over the latch. For a moment, he looked back at Sarah, as if asking for strength without saying it. Then he opened the door. The nursery was simple, untouched, and still. A faint layer of dust covered the crib rail. The sight of it made Jacob's throat tighten, but he didn't turn away this time. He stepped inside and cleared his voice. "I kept it closed because I thought opening it would finish me," he said. But keeping it closed didn't save me. It just kept me stuck. Sarah stood in the doorway behind him, Emma on her hip. She didn't rush him. She only came close enough to let him feel her presence. Jacob turned and faced them both. "I want to adopt Emma," he said, the words firm despite the shake in his chest. "Not as a favor, not as a rescue. As my daughter." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she nodded quickly, as if she couldn't trust her voice. Emma babbled and reached for Jacob again, and he took her carefully, holding her against his shoulder like he had done 100 times now. In the weeks that followed, the ranch changed in quiet ways. Sarah planted a small patch of herbs by the cabin wall. Jacob repaired the fence that had leaned for years. A neighbor rode out once the roads cleared and raised an eyebrow at the sound of laughter inside the cabin, but Jacob only tipped his hat and kept working. When Jacob finally asked Sarah to marry him, he didn't do it with a grand speech. He did it while standing by the stove, Emma asleep between them, and he simply said, "Let's stop calling this temporary." Sarah smiled through tears and answered, "Yes." By the time the first green showed across the pasture, the cabin no longer felt like a place people hid from life. It felt like a place they chose, every day, with open eyes and honest hearts. And on one calm evening, when Emma reached for Jacob and then for Sarah, linking them without knowing what she was doing, Jacob realized something that would stay with him forever. Love had returned to his house the same way spring returned to the land. Slow, stubborn, and real. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Carry it with you. Share it with someone who needs hope and come back for the next one.